Hello, and welcome to this video on getting started with Duende IdentityServer. In this video, we'll look at a few things. The first thing we'll do is see how to install Duende IdentityServer from scratch. And when we do that, we'll create in-memory stores. So everything will be in memory, including things like the clients and the users. Once we've done that, we'll create an API client and see how to secure that client. And then we'll use the command line to see how we can create a token and use that token to attach to the client. And then finally, we'll write an MVC application. And that MVC application will talk to our API. We'll see how to configure the MVC application to get a token to talk to the API. And we'll then see how we can use IdentityServer to also provide authentication. So we'll add some UI to IdentityServer and we'll use that user interface to log on a user. And we'll see how to configure the MVC application to use IdentityServer to provide that authentication. Okay, let's get started. So there are a few ways that we could start our project. One way would be to use the IdentityServer templates. These are provided by Duende. And to do that, we'd first have to install the templates. To install the templates, we can run .NET new install and then duende.templates. And this will install the template for me. Now, as we can see, I already have these installed. Once we install the templates, it shows us the list of templates available. And we can see here we have things like Duende IdentityServer with the short name of Duende-IS to create an identity server project. We have an empty project. We have one with what's called a quick start UI, which we'll use later. And then at the end here, we have this Duende-IS in-mem project. And that lets us create a Duende IdentityServer instance with in-memory clients, in-memory users, with everything in memory. To create a project from that template, we'd run .NET new and then give it the short name of the template. So Duende-IS-in-mem. And if I run that, it creates a project for me. So it creates all the code needed for that project and a CS_proj file. Now, we aren't going to use this. This will be cheating. We are going to build this from scratch. So to do that, let me create a directory for this project. I'll just call this IDS and we can change into that directory. And then inside here, I want to create a few things. I want to create an empty MVC project and I want to create a solution to hold that project. So the first thing I want to do is to create a new solution. And I do that by calling .NET new. SLN is the short name for the solution template. And then we give this thing a name with a -n flag. So we'll call our solution in memory. Once I have that, I can create an empty web project where we'll set up IdentityServer. Again, to do that, I call .NET new. This time I use web as the template name. And again, -n in memory for the name of the project this time. And this creates us an empty ASP.NET Core project. And if I look in this directory, we can see we've got our in-memory solution and then a subdirectory that contains that project. Now I'm going to use Rider to write the code here. So if I open up this solution inside Rider, and remember we call the solution in memory, and then in here go to add existing project, go to the in-memory directory and add the in-memory CS_proj file. And if we look inside this project, we can see it has a program CS file and it has a properties file with a launch settings JSON in. Now the first thing I want to do is inside here, I want to change the ports we're going to use for IdentityServer. So I'm going to change the HTTPS port to 5443. It doesn't matter what I change the HTTP ports to. We aren't going to use this, but I'll just change these to 5000 anyway, just to be consistent. And we can run this application just to see that it works. And if I show the browser, we can see the application just prints out the text, hello world. And back in the project code, inside program.cs, we can see that that's all the application does. It maps the root URL and outputs the text, hello world. And obviously we'll change this and we'll install IdentityServer into this project. So to add IdentityServer, the first thing we have to do is add the NuGet package. So if I go into NuGet and do a search on Duende, we find Duende.IdentityServer. I can add that into this in-memory project and just click on the install button. Once we have that, we then need to add Identity Server to our services. So in program.cs, I can say builder.services.add Identity Server. And we can configure this. So in the call to add Identity Server, there's a Lambda that gets called. We pass in this options parameter to that Lambda, and there are various things that we want to add here. The first is to tell Identity Server which events we're interested in. Now, these are events that are fired by Identity Server that we can explicitly handle if we want to, but by default, Identity Server will itself respond to these events and put output into our log files so we can see what's going on. So here we can say options.events, and there are various events we want Identity Server to raise. There's the error events, there's information events, the failure events, and the success events. And at this point, really, they are the only options that we need. Now, we're building an in-memory version of Identity Server, so we're not using a database here. So we have to configure Identity Server with in-memory data. And the way we do that is by calling various methods after we call add Identity Server. We want to add various things to this. We want to add some test users, and this takes a list of test users, and we'll fill that list in a moment. As well as the test users, there are some in-memory clients we want to add, and again, this takes a list of client types. There are in-memory API resources we want to add, and again, a list of API resource. There are API scopes we want to add, and finally, there are in-memory identity resources that we want to add. Now, at the moment, obviously here, we have no clients, we have no users. We'll add those in a moment. But we can still see Identity Server in action. But before we run the code again, I have to call app.useIdentityServer to add Identity Server into the pipeline. Now, with that in place, if I rerun the application and then go back to the browser, now at the moment, it looks exactly the same. But what we can now do is browse to what's known as the discovery document. And that discovery document is at a well-known endpoint. And that endpoint is .well-known/openid-configuration. And if I browse to this, if Identity Server is installed correctly, we'll get this document. And this document is used by clients of Identity Server to discover information about Identity Server. For example, there are a bunch of URLs defined here, such as the token endpoint, that our applications will use. Also notice down here, there are things like the claims that have been supported, the grant types that are supported, the response types that are supported, and so on and so forth. Now, at the moment, we haven't added any clients or any resources into Identity Server. So let's go and do that now. So earlier, I created a version of Identity Server from the templates. And I'm now going to steal some of the code from those templates. In particular, there's code provided by the template to generate some in-memory users and to generate the other in-memory client information that we need. I'm just going to copy those two files into this project. The two files I've copied are testusers.cs and config.cs. Test users provide us with two users. There's one called Alice with a password of Alice, and there's one called Bob with a password of Bob. In config.cs, we have a couple of scopes, and I've adapted this from the file I copied across. So I've added two scopes here called weatherapi.read and weatherapi.write. Now, I've added these scopes because the MVC API application that we generate from the template displays weather information, and we want to know whether we are allowed to access that data or not. We have an API resource, again called weatherapi, that has scopes called weatherapi.read and weatherapi.write. And we then have two clients. Now, clients are applications that are going to interact with Identity Server in some way. And these clients will get tokens. They'll get access tokens, identity tokens, and so on. The two clients we have here, one's called M2M. This is a machine-to-machine client. This has the allowed scopes of weatherapi.read and weatherapi.write. And notice there's a client secret. And this client secret will be used by the client to prove it is who it says it is. Similarly, for the interactive client, this interactive client will be an MVC application, And again, this MVC application needs access to certain scopes, including weather_API.read. We'll talk more about the interactive client later on in this video. So to use these, back in program.cs, where we create these empty lists of test users, clients, and so on, I can now plug in these values. So for my test users, I can say test users.users. And then similarly for things like the in-memory clients, the in-memory API resources, and the other resources and scopes that we need. So we'll have config.clients, config.api resource, config.api scopes, and config.identity resources. So if I run this code again and go back to the browser and refresh the OpenID configuration endpoint, we can now see we have some extra information. We have some scopes that are supported, things like OpenID and profile, weather_API.read and weather_API.write. And we have some claims that are supported, whereas before these were blank. So we now have extra information inside this document. So this document now provides extra configuration information that our clients can use when trying to get tokens. So in a moment, we'll add an MVC API application into this project. And that application, as I've said, will provide weather data. It will have an endpoint that we are going to call, and I want to protect that endpoint so that only authorized clients are allowed to use that endpoint. Now to do that, our client will need to get a token. So where do they get that token from? Well, notice in this document, we have a URL called token_endpoint. So I can send a request to that endpoint to get a token. Now, to get that token, I have to specify a scope, for example, weather_API.read, and I have to specify the client secret. And that client secret is a secret that's configured inside IDS that only the client should know. And in our case, it will be this client secret here. So let's go and add this MVC application, and then let's see how we can get a token and use that token to connect to the application. So again, I'm going to add this application from the command line. So again, we run .NET new. This time, I'm going to use the web API template. And by default, this will create an application that serves up some weather data, and I'm going to call this weather API. And if I go back into Rider, on the solution, add an existing project, and we'll add in the weather API project. Again, inside here, inside launch settings, I'm going to change these ports. So for the HTTPS port, we'll change this to 5445. And for the HTTP ports, we'll change these to 5002. Now again, we won't be using HTTP, but this is just for completeness sake. So if I go to Rider and the Run menu and look at weather_API.https and run the application, it's listening on port 5445. If I go back to the browser and hit the localhost port 5445 weather forecast endpoint, then we get this weather data. Now currently this endpoint is unprotected, so anybody can get at this data. I want to change that so only clients that have the correct secret can access this endpoint. So to do that, the first thing we have to do is secure the service. So back inside Rider, if I go to the Weather API's program.cs file, we can see we have this app.map_get to the weather forecast endpoint, and that serves up the data. And I can add an authorized attribute to this endpoint. If I rerun the application, go back to the browser and refresh, then we now get an exception. Now in this case, it's telling me that we've asked for authorization, but we haven't configured any middleware to handle this authorization yet. So let's do that next. So a client, to prove that they are authorized, is going to present this application with a token. Now the client application gets that token from IDS. This API then presents that token to IDS and says, is this correct? That token is called a bearer token. And in this application, we have to configure bearer authentication. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is to add a package called Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.authentication.jwt bearer. Now, JWT stands for JSON Web Token. and you'll hear the phrase JOT. So JWT will be pronounced JOT. This is a JOT bearer token. And I need to add this to my weather API project. So back in program.cs, I need to add a couple of services. I need to say builder.services.add authorization and builder.services.add authentication. Now, when I call add authentication, I have to specify the name of the scheme we're going to use. And we'll use a standard name here. And we get that name from a constant. And that constant is JOT bearer defaults dot authentication scheme. Once I have that, I then want to add the bearer scheme. So I can say add JWT bearer. This takes an options. And on these options, I need to configure three things. I first need to specify the authority. And this authority is identity server. So I have to specify the URL of identity server here. So I can say options.authority is https://localhost : and remember we configured identity server to be listening on port 5443. I also have to specify the audience. And if you like, that's the name of the API that we are. And in this case, that's going to be Weather API. And again, this is configured inside IDS as the name of the API resource. And finally, I have to specify what tokens we accept here. And for that, we say options.token validation parameters.valid types. And the valid type for this is something known as AT plus JWT. So with that in place, after we build the application, I need to say app.use authentication and then app.use authorization. So if I run the application again and then go back to the browser, previously we were getting this error. No middleware was found that supports authorization. If I refresh this now, we get a different error. Instead, we're now getting back a 401. So we're getting back an unauthenticated. So we now know that our pipeline is in place. But what that now means is that to access this endpoint, I need to get and use a token. So let's go and see how we do that from the command line first of all. So if you remember, Identity Server provides an endpoint that allows me to go and ask for a token. And that endpoint is this localhost 5443/connect/token endpoint. So I can send a post request to that endpoint. When I send this request, I have to specify a few things. I specify the name of the client. In this case, that's m2m.client. The scope, that's going to be weather API.read, and the client secret. And that's this 51153. That's this UUID that we added into Identity Server. In this case, I'm going to use curl to send this request. And if this succeeds, it should send me back this token. So if I copy the curl command from here, make sure the server is running. That's the server listening on port 5443, and it is. Go back to the command line and paste this command in. And sure enough, we get back this JSON object. And this JSON object contains this token. And that token is this value here. And we can examine this. So if I copy this value, there are websites that let me look inside this value. There's one called jot.io, and there's another called jot.ms. Either one is fine. If I go into the website and paste in this token, we can see what this token looks like. And it contains 3 bits of information. The first piece is some metadata, some information about the token itself, and then various claims. And if I look at the claims, there's things like NBF, not before. So this specifies the earliest time at which this token can be used. Issued at specifies when this token was created. Notice there's an audience, Weather API, and that's the audience we plugged into our Weather API application. Scope, Weather API.read, that's the scope we want to use, and then the client ID, which is the M2M client. So now that we have that token, I can send a GET request to my weather forecast endpoint, passing along that token. Now we pass along that token in an authorization header. It's a bearer token. So we say authorization : bearer, and then the value of the token. Again, I'm going to use curl to do this. So if I go back to the command line and paste in that new curl request with this token attached, sure enough, we now get back the weather data. Now notice to do this, I need to know the client ID, I need to know the client secret, and I need to know the scopes. Given those 3 values, I can get a token Once I have the token, I can present that token to my weather forecast endpoint. It can check the token is valid, and then it will present back to me the data. So that's all well and fine. So we can do this from the command line. But how do we do this from another application, from another client? So to make use of this weather API, I'm going to add another application into our project. And we'll add an MVC application. This time I'll do it from inside Rider. So if I go to the Project Explorer, right-click on the solution and do Add and Add New Project, we're going to add a web app. And it's a model view controller application. And we'll call this Weather MVC. Now notice here for authentication, I'm saying no authentication. So if we create this, so the first thing I want to do is to check the ports that we're using here. So if we go to Properties and Launch Settings, I want to make sure we're using port 5444 for our HTTPS endpoint, and we are. Now, why do I care about these ports so much? Well, if I go back into IdentityServer and look at the configuration, for my interactive client, we can see we have some URLs referenced here. And these are URLs that our interactive client is going to use. And these URLs are localhost with port 5444. So these ports have to match, i.e. the URL my interactive client is using has to match the URL we've configured inside IdentityServer. So with that in place, let me go back into the Weather API, into program.cs, and remove this authorized attribute. Now I'm only doing that to prove that our Weather MVC application can talk to the Weather API application when there's no authorization in place. And then we'll add the code back in to enforce authorization. Okay, so inside the Weather MVC application, we have this home controller. And to this controller, I want to add an extra endpoint. And I'm going to call that endpoint weather. And the endpoint will look like this. So it'll be an async call, and it returns a task of iAction result. When somebody uses this MVC application and hits this endpoint, inside here, I'm going to turn around and call the API endpoint. And to do that, I'm going to use an HTTP client. So I want to say something like using var client equals new HTTP client. I'm then going to use this client to call the weather forecast endpoint. And I can do that by calling getAsync. Now, our weather forecast application is listing on the URL localhost port 5445, and weather forecast is the endpoint we want to hit. And then I'm going to say something like if result.isSuccessCode, we're going to do something, and we'll see what we're going to do in a moment. And if it fails, I'm just going to throw an exception. Now, normally we wouldn't do this, obviously, but in this case, just to make life easy, we'll just throw an exception that shows something's gone wrong. Now, we've seen from our console application that when we call this endpoint, it will return back to me some JSON. And I need to decode that JSON. To do that, into my models folder here, I'm going to add a new class. In fact, we'll add a record called weather data. And this record will have 4 fields. It'll have the date that the data was generated, the temperature in Celsius, the temperature in Fahrenheit, and some summary. And this is the data that gets returned from the Weather API application. Now, to decode the incoming JSON into a list of these records, I'm going to use Newtonsoft's JSON library. So again, inside NuGet, if I do a search on Newtonsoft, we'll find newtonsoft.json, and I'm going to add that into the Weather MVC application. Inside my controller, I'm going to say something like var model equals await result.content.read as string async. And that will give me back the string representation of this data, i.e. the raw JSON if you like. I can then say var data equals JSON convert dot deserialize object. And we're going to deserialize this data. To deserialize object, we have to tell it the shape of the data. And that's going to be a list of weather data objects. And to this function call, we need to pass the data to be deserialized, i.e. the raw string. Now, once I have that, I want the user to see this data. So to do that, I'm going to create a view. And to the view, I'm going to pass this model. And inside the view, we'll just display the data. Now, I'm not going to write the view here. I'm just going to copy in a file. And that file looks like this. It references this model, which is a list of weather data. It has a table, iterates over the data in the model, and just displays that data. So let me go and run the API application, which is my weather API. And then let me run the MVC application, which is weather MVC. If I go to the browser, we get the standard template homepage. From here, if I browse to /home/weather, then we get to see the weather data. So we get the date, we get the time, we get this note, which is bracing hot, and we get the temperatures. Now this is just randomized data. So if I refresh this, we'll get some more random data, but we are getting the data. Now, if I go back into the API application and go back to program.cs, and I add back in the authorize attribute, apply the changes, I'm going to restart the application, make sure everything is okay. If I go back to the browser, and again I'm at /home/weather and refresh, we are now getting an exception. Because when I try and get this data, we're getting back a 401 error. When I get back that 401 error, remember that my code is pretty stupid. It just throws an exception because something has gone wrong. So we can see that we are not authorized. We're not allowed to access this data. And that's the next step. We'll add in authorization into these applications. So I'm going to add this authorization in two parts. The first thing I'm going to do is to treat my weather MVC application simply as if it was a client of the API application. i.e., I'm not going to care what users are involved. I just want to make my weather API available to my weather MVC. And I'm going to do that in a similar way we did it with curl. I'm going to call the token endpoint directly and get back a token. So to do that, I'm going to add a service into the application and have the service do that work for me. So inside weather MVC, I'm going to add a new directory called services. And then inside here, we'll add the service. Now my service is going to make use of some helper code. And the code it's going to use is provided by Duende. They have a library called identity model. And we can use that library to make this token handling much simpler. So in my weather MVC application, if I open up NuGet and look for Duende.identityModel, and I can add this package into my weather MVC application. Okay, so with that added, what do these services look like? So this service consists of three parts. There's an interface called iTokenService, and that has a method called getToken. The implementation of that is in the token service class, and that looks like this. So token service implements iTokenService, it gets past a logger, and it gets past some settings to do with identity server. And this is things like the URL of identity server, for example. Inside getToken, we create an HTTP client, and we then send a request to identity server asking for the token. And as part of this request, we pass along the client ID, we pass along the client secret, and we pass along some scopes. This will call the token endpoint. And if that succeeds, it will return the token back to me. And I can then use that token to call the weather API. These identity server settings look like this. They have the discovery URL. It has the client name, which is going to be the name of our client, M to M. It has the client password, which in this case is the client secret. Now I'm going to provide these settings inside my app settings JSON file. So inside appsettings.json, we have a new section called Identity Server Settings. That contains the discovery URL, which is the address of our identity server instance, the name of the client, m2m.client, and the client password, i.e. the client secret. And I'm going to read those into the application and use those to get this token. So how do we use this service? So inside my home controller, I'm going to add a constructor, and into that constructor, I'm going to pass a reference to this token service. So we'll have an iTokenService, and we'll call it token service. Let me just import that. Now, rather than adding a separate constructor here, we can add this parameter to the class definition itself. So we can make it look like this, and then get rid of the constructor entirely. So I use this token service inside the weather endpoint. So after I create my HTTP client, I'm going to say token service.getToken. And then to this, we pass the scope. So into here, we're going to say weather API.read. And that will give me back a token. Now this is an async call, so we need to await on this. Let me make sure I spell this correctly. Once I have the token, I can attach the token to my HTTP client before it makes the get async call. And we do that by saying client.setBearerToken token.access token. And I'm going to ignore the warning here that this might be a null reference argument. If it comes back as null, the whole thing will just blow up in this case. Now, obviously, in production code, you don't want that, but this is a simple demo. So once I have that token, when I call client.getAsync, that token is passed along. Now remember, we said this was bearer authentication, and we are passing along this bearer token in the same way we did it from the curl command line client. Now, before I get this to work, we have to configure this token service. So back inside program.cs, for this weather MVC application, we need to add the token service into the list of services. So I can say builder.services.add_singleton, and this will be an iToken service to token service. So it knows that when it sees an iToken service passed in to create an instance of the token service. I also need to add the configuration to this. So I want to say builder.services.configure, and we're going to configure our identity server settings. This is the section that's in app-settings.json. So to configure this, I need to say builder.configuration.getSection, and the section name is identity server settings. So with that in place, our application should now be configured to use this bearer token. Now to test this out, I need to run all three applications. So I need to run my identity server instance, I need to run the API application, and I need to run the MVC application. And then if I go to the browser, where before we were getting an exception, if I hit this endpoint now, we get back the data. So even though the endpoint is now asking for authorization, we are now passing along this bearer token. That bearer token has been accepted by the API application and is returning the data back to us. Now we're doing all of this without any user authentication. So let's go and add that next. So what I'd like to happen is to have a user of my MVC application. That user needs to be authenticated when they try and hit this weather endpoint. After they've been authenticated, they get back a bearer token, and we can use that bearer token to get the weather data back. Now to do that, we need to add this in two steps. We need to add a user interface that our user can use to log in, and that user interface is part of Identity Server. And then we need to change the MVC application to force the user to log in when we need to be authenticated. So for our user to log in, they have to have a user interface. And rather than having our application provide that user interface, we'll have Identity Server provide that user interface. Now, Identity Server comes with another template, and that's the Quick Start UI template. So if I change directory to be the Identity Server directory, which remember I called in memory, in here, I can do .NET new Duende -is-UI, and that will install this Quick Start template for me. So back inside Rider, if I look at this, we'll find we now have this Pages folder installed, and this contains all the code we need for this user interface. Now notice there's one issue here, and that's because we now have the two test user files. So I'm just going to delete the one that's been added as part of this template, and then all these errors should go away. So to make use of this user interface, I need to amend my program.cs file. Remember that currently we map our root URL to be the text hello world. We can now get rid of that. And instead in here, we can start calling some APIs that allow us to make use of this template. So I can say app.use static files. We want to say app.use routing to set up the routing correctly. We already have our app.use identity server. And then I also need to say app.use authorization. So after app.use authorization, we need to say app.map razor pages. And then on this, we need to say require authorization. So we set up authorization on these razor pages. And then on the builder, we need to add in razor page support. So we call builder.services.add razor pages. And then we should be good to go inside this identity server code. And if I run this application now, remember it's in memory, and browse to the root URL, where before we were getting the text hello world, we now get the Duende Identity Server welcome page. So it looks like the user interface has been installed correctly. So at the moment, we have Identity Server configured, but we configure our MVC application. we have to mark our endpoint as needing authorization, and then we have to configure the pipeline to provide the correct sort of authorization. So in the MVC code, if I go to the home controller, for the weather endpoint, we mark this as authorize. Let me just kill the application here so we stop getting these warnings. So with that in place, if I try and hit this endpoint from a browser, it'll ask me to do authorization, and we'll get the same error that we saw previously on the API. It will tell me there's nothing configured in the pipeline. So to configure that, if I go into the MVC program.cs file, in here, I need to add a number of things. So before I configure anything, I need to add in a NuGet package that provides the support I need. We're going to use OIDC as the authentication mechanism, and I need to add in Microsoft's OIDC support into this application. So again, on my NuGet tab, if I look for Microsoft.ASP.NETCore.authentication.OpenID and we have this package, and we can add that into the Weather MVC application. So with that in place, we can now configure authentication inside program.cs. So the first thing we do is called builder.services.add.authentication. And then we configure authentication by using the Lambda. Inside here, there are a couple of things we have to configure. So first of all, we have to configure what's known as the default scheme. This is the fallback scheme, if you like. So this is the scheme that gets used when others aren't specified. Now we're going to use the cookie scheme for this, and we can use the text cookies if we want to, but there's also a constant we can use. And that constant is in cookie authentication defaults.authentication scheme. Similarly, we want to configure the default challenge scheme. This is going to be the OIDC scheme. And again, we can just use the text OIDC, or we can also say OpenID Connect defaults.authentication scheme. And these are both just strings that provide the name for these schemes. Once that's in place, we need to add the cookie scheme, and we need to add the OpenID Connect scheme. Now, when we add the OpenID Connect scheme, again, we have to specify the name that we're using for this scheme. So again, that's going to be OpenID Connect.defaults.authentication scheme. And again, we configure this scheme through a Lambda. Now in here, there are various options that we have to set. And we have to tell the scheme which OIDC server we're using. And the server we are going to use, of course, is IdentityServer. And I'm going to put that configuration data into my app settings file. So again, inside appsettings.json on the MVC project, I'm going to add another configuration section. And I'm going to call that section Interactive Service Settings. And that will look like this. It has the authority URL, which is the URL of IdentityServer. It has the client ID, which in this case is interactive. It has the client secret, which in this case is this 49C value. And it has the scopes that we want to use. Back inside program.cs, I want to configure the authority, the client ID, and the client secret. And I configure those from the data that's held inside my app settings. Now I also need to add some information to OpenID Connect to tell it how to work. First of all, I need to add what's known as the response type. And we set the response type to be the value code. Now this is short for authorization code flow, which is one of the flows that we have inside OIDC. When we use authorization code flow, I also want to turn on something called PKCE, which is proof key for code exchange. This makes our flow more secure, and this really is something you should be using. And finally, we set what's known as the response mode. And we set response mode to be query, i.e. we're going to use a query string to manage our responses. We then need to set two more things. I want to tell OIDC that we should be saving the tokens, and then I want to tell OIDC which scopes we're using. Now remember, the scopes are held in our interactive service settings, and we store these as an array of scopes. So inside my configuration, I say options.scope.add, and again, I'm going to get this data from the configuration. So we do builder.configuration, and then we say interactive service settings, scope, 0. So we get back the 0th entry in the array, i.e. the first entry in the array, if you like. Okay, so this should now allow our user to authenticate. When we authenticate, we'll get back a couple of tokens. And we want to use one of those tokens to talk to the API server. Now, previously, we were using the token service to get the token, and we no longer need to do that. Instead, what I can do is use the HTTP context and call it getTokenAsync method. And getTokenAsync will return me the access token that I need. So I can say something like var token equals await getTokenAsync, and that will return me back this token. And I can simply pass that token as the bearer token on the client. Back in program.cs, where we call app.useAuthorization, I also need to call app.useAuthentication. And then we should be good to go. So again, if I run my copy of IdentityServer, run the weather API, and finally run the MVC application. So I go to the browser, and I'm running in an incognito window here, just we have no authentication in place at the moment. If I hit the home/weather endpoint, it asks me to authenticate. Remember, we have two users. We have a user called Alice with a password of Alice, and we have a user called Bob with a password of Bob. Let me use the Alice user here. And if I click on login, then sure enough, we're authenticated. We get back our access token. We can use that access token to talk to the API, to the weather service, and we get back that data. Now, there may be one thing here that you're used to seeing that we're not seeing, and that's a consent screen. So if I go back into the applications and inside the config for IdentityServer, on the client configuration, I can add an entry which says require consent, and we can set that to true. And if I apply these changes, restart my instance of IdentityServer, and then go back to the browser, from here again, we can hit home/weather. We get asked to authenticate, so I can enter Alice and log in. And now we get to the consent screen. Interactive is the name of the client, so interactive is requesting your permission, and it tells the user what information this application is asking for. If we click on yes, allow, then again we get logged in, we get authenticated, we get given the access token, and we can access the API. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. You can find the code for this video on GitHub at https://github.com/kevinrjones/duende-is-getting-started.